The cold wind slithered through the narrow alleyways of Kyoto, slipping between the wooden houses and stirring the brittle autumn leaves at my feet. The scent of rain lingered in the air, mixing with the distant aroma of roasted chestnuts from a street vendor nearby. I had planned for a quiet morning, just me, my camera, and the golden glow of the season reflected in the temple ponds. But fate had other plans. A sound cut through the stillness. Thin, fragile cries, barely audible over the whispering wind. My body stiffened. I turned toward the noise, my pulse quickening. The sound was coming from behind a stack of old wooden crates, half hidden beside a rusting bicycle in the shadows. The cries wavered between exhaustion and desperation, like tiny voices pleading for help. Carefully, I stepped closer, crouching low to move aside a damp, tattered piece of cardboard. The moment my fingers touched it, the smell of damp fur and decay hit me. Then I saw them. 3 kittens, barely bigger than my palm, were huddled together in a trembling mass, their fur matted and slick from the cold. They pressed themselves against the still form of their mother, a frail white cat whose body was frighteningly thin. Her ribs jutted out beneath her patchy fur, her breath shallow and labored. A weak exhale left her lips, barely a whisper against the wind. My throat tightened. She was still alive, but just barely. I swallowed hard. I had never been involved in animal rescue before, never faced a moment like this. Yet as I watched those tiny creatures shiver against their dying mother, something inside me shifted. I couldn't just walk away. The alley was damp, the ground slick with the residue of last night's rain. The scent of mildew and rust clung to the air, and the faint hum of distant traffic felt worlds away from this forgotten corner of the city. I knelt beside the small family, my hands hovering just inches above them, unsure of my next move. The kittens whimpered softly, their tiny bodies shuddering with each breath. The mother cat, Yuki, barely stirred, her clouded eyes half open, staring past me as if she had already accepted her fate. I hesitated. Would she attack if I touched her kittens? Even in her weakened state, motherly instincts could still be sharp, but she didn't move. It was as if she had already surrendered to whatever was coming next. I exhaled and reached out, brushing my fingers against one of the kittens, Suta, the smallest of the 3. He flinched, but didn't run. His fur was damp and ice cold. A rush of urgency shot through me. If I didn't do something, they wouldn't let it. I glanced around, searching for help, but the alley remained empty. No signs, no people, just me and this fragile little world clinging to the edge of survival. I swallowed hard, then unzipped my jacket, gently scooping the kittens inside, feeling their feeble warmth against my chest. Then, with a deep breath, I reached for Yuki. The moment my hands touched her frail body, she let out a weak, rasping breath. I whispered, "Hold on, I've got you." The moment I cradled Yuki in my arms, I felt just how fragile she was. Her body was alarmingly light, as if she were made of paper-thin bones and fading breath. Her heartbeat, weak but steady, pulsed against my palm. The kittens wriggled against my chest inside my jacket, their tiny claws kneading at the fabric, but they were too exhausted to struggle. I stood up, shielding them from the wind, and hurried toward the only place I could think of, Hina Tanaka's clinic. Hina was a veterinary student running a small, unofficial shelter out of her home. We weren't particularly close, but my sister Mika often raved about her dedication to stray animals. If anyone could help, it was her. By the time I reached her door, my arms ached from holding them so tightly. I knocked once, twice, then she opened the door, blinking in surprise at the sight of me, soaked in cold air and desperation. "What happened?" she asked, already reaching for the kittens. "Found them in an alley," I murmured. "The mother, she's not doing well." Hina's expression darkened as she took Yuki from my hands, her fingers checking for signs of life. A frown formed on her lips. "She's in critical condition, malnourished, probably sick. The kittens, they're weak, but we might have a chance." I swallowed, watching as she moved with practiced urgency. That flicker of hope in her voice, "we might have a chance," kept me standing. But deep inside, I wondered if we were already too late. Hina wasted no time. She placed Yuki on a soft towel and started checking her vitals while I gently set the kittens in a makeshift box lined with a heating pad. The tiny creatures clung to each other, their frail bodies barely responding as warmth seeped into them. I watched, my heart pounding, as Hina pressed a stethoscope to Yuki's chest. Her face tensed, her breathing's weak. If we don't get her stabilized soon. She trailed off, reaching for a syringe. I'll give her fluids, but we need more than just basic care. She needs a real clinic, Renji. I clenched my jaw. Can you take her there? She hesitated. There's a problem. The animal hospital won't accept an unregistered stray unless we take financial responsibility. And with her condition, treatment will be expensive. My stomach dropped. I hadn't even thought about the cost. I had barely enough savings to scrape by. How was I supposed to afford an emergency vet bill? Before I could respond, a weak, rasping sound broke through the tension. Yuki. Her thin body convulsed slightly, and a strained, wheezing meow escaped her lips. Hina's fingers hovered over her, a look of urgency flashing across her face. She's deteriorating. We don't have time to decide. I looked at the kittens huddled together, then back at their mother. If I walked away, she wouldn't make it. But if I stayed, I took a breath. Tell me what I need to do. The air in Hina's small clinic had shifted, thick with tension, the quiet hum of the overhead light barely masking the shallow, labored breaths coming from Yuki's frail body. The kittens, though still weak, stirred slightly under the warmth of the heating pad, their tiny paws twitching in restless, unconscious movements, as if they were searching for the mother who no longer had the strength to comfort them. Hina worked quickly, preparing an IV drip with practiced precision, but I could see it in her expression, the quiet calculation of a professional who had seen too many cases like this, who knew when the odds were not in her favor. I swallowed against the dryness in my throat, watching her every movement, knowing I had already stepped into something far beyond what I was prepared for. She didn't stop moving as she spoke, her voice steady but carrying the weight of urgency. We have to stabilize her first. Fluids will help, but she needs real treatment. Nutrients, tests, medication. If she has an infection, it might already be too late. She paused only long enough to glance up at me, her eyes sharp, searching mine for an answer I didn't have. You have to decide now. If you can't cover the costs, we won't be able to get her admitted. I felt my pulse in my ears, loud and insistent, the reality of the situation pressing against me like an unseen force. I had come here on instinct, moved by the sound of desperate cries in a forgotten alley, by the sight of 3 helpless kittens clinging to their mother's failing body. But this was different. This was real, immediate, impossible to ignore. I had never owned a pet, never been responsible for a life that wasn't my own. Yet here I was, standing in the middle of a decision I never saw coming. My hands clenched at my sides as I glanced at Yuki again, her ribs rising and falling with fragile, uneven breaths. The life inside her was flickering, hanging on by a thread, but she was still here, still fighting. Mika's voice echoed in my head, her words from years ago when we were kids feeding strays behind our old house. You can't save them all, Renji, but the ones you can, you have to try. I looked up at Hina, my decision already made, even as the weight of it settled into my bones. Do whatever you have to. I'll figure it out. She studied me for a moment, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly before she nodded. Without another word, she turned back to Yuki, adjusting the IV drip, her movements swift, controlled. I exhaled slowly, forcing my hands to relax as I stepped closer to the kittens, their tiny bodies curled together, unaware of the battle unfolding around them. I had no idea what came next. No idea if I had just made a promise I wouldn't be able to keep. But as I gently ran a finger over the smallest kitten's head, feeling the delicate warmth of life still clinging to him, I knew one thing for certain. I was already in this too deep to walk away. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and something warm, something alive, as the heating pad slowly infused the kittens with the strength they had nearly lost. Hina worked without pause, adjusting the IV line, checking Yuki's sluggish pulse, her fingers steady despite the unspoken weight in the air. I stayed by the kittens, my hands resting near them, as if my presence alone could keep them tethered to this world. Their fragile chests rose and fell in uneven rhythms, and though their bodies still trembled, the desperate mewling had softened, their exhaustion winning out over their fear. Then the door creaked open, the movement cutting through the quiet. Takumi Ishida stepped inside, his weathered face set with concern, his coat damp from the lingering chill of the outside air. The old bookstore owner had always been a familiar presence in the town, his shop a quiet sanctuary filled with forgotten stories. But I had never seen him like this, his brow furrowed, his movements unusually tense as he took in the sight before him. His eyes settled on Yuki, and something in his expression shifted, something deeper than mere sympathy. "I knew she wouldn't last much longer," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "She used to linger near the shop, just at the edge of the streetlights. She never let me close, but she always came back." His voice was rough with unspoken regret as his gaze flickered to the kittens. "They're hers, then." Hina straightened, wiping her hands against her scrub pants, the exhaustion evident in her movements. "She's in bad shape. If she pulls through, it'll be a miracle. Renji's covering her care, but we'll need more than luck to get through the next few days." Takumi exhaled slowly, the deep kind of breath a man takes when he's deciding whether or not to say something that's been weighing on him for a long time. His eyes moved to me, steady and knowing, before he finally spoke. "There's something you need to know about her." He hesitated only for a moment before adding, "She wasn't always a stray." I felt the words settle in my chest like stones sinking into deep water, their weight unsettling, shifting something I hadn't expected. Yuki had belonged to someone who had either lost her or abandoned her. And that meant somewhere, buried in her past, was a story I hadn't accounted for, one that might change everything. The room felt smaller, heavier, as Takumi's words settled between us. The revelation that Yuki wasn't always a stray shifted something in my mind, twisting my perception of her fragile existence from an inevitable fate to something deliberate, something caused. I studied her frail body, her ears barely flicking as Hina adjusted the IV, and I wondered what kind of life she had before she ended up fighting for breath in a damp alley. Had she been loved once? Had she belonged to someone who whispered her name in the soft hours of the night, who let her curl into the crook of their arm? Or had she been discarded like so many others, left to fend for herself in a world that rarely offered second chances? Takumi's voice was quiet but firm. If she had an owner, they either didn't care enough to look for her, or they left her behind on purpose. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. The town has seen its fair share of abandoned pets. People move, they change their minds, and the ones left behind don't get a say in it. I swallowed hard, staring at the kittens nestled together, oblivious to the weight of their mother's past. "So what do we do now?" I asked, though the question felt bigger than just this moment, bigger than the 4 lives hanging in the balance. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure if I had it in me to carry the weight of someone else's choices. The weight of Takumi's words pressed against me, but before I could process it, Hina cursed under her breath. I turned just in time to see Yuki's frail body convulse, her back arching slightly before slumping, as if the last thread holding her to life had begun to unravel. The heart monitor flickered erratically. Hina moved fast, adjusting the IV, pressing 2 fingers against Yuki's thin chest. My pulse spiked, the room narrowing to the sound of the unsteady beeps and the shallow gasps from the kittens, their bodies shifting as if they could sense something slipping away. "She's crashing," Hina muttered, more to herself than to us. Her hands moved with controlled urgency, her fingers steady despite the tension rippling through the air. "Come on, girl, not yet." I had never felt so useless. I watched as Hina injected something into the IV line, her jaw tight, her focus unshaken. Takumi stood still, his usual quiet demeanor heavier now, unreadable. Seconds stretched unbearably long before Yuki's body shuddered and went still. A suffocating silence filled the room. And then, a breath. Shallow, weak, but there. Hina exhaled, her shoulders dropping ever so slightly, though the crease in her brow never eased. "She's holding on," she murmured, almost like she was talking to Yuki herself, coaxing her to keep fighting. But then she turned to me, her gaze sharp. "We need to find out where she came from. If she belonged to someone, there might be more to this than we think." Takumi, silent until now, shifted, his eyes dark with something I couldn't place. "There is," he sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, but I think I know who she belonged to." The air in the room felt electric, anticipation coiling tight in my chest. Whatever he was about to say, whatever truth he had been holding back, It was going to change everything. Takumi hesitated, his fingers absently brushing over the sleeve of his coat as if weighing the weight of the truth he was about to release. The room remained suspended in thick silence, broken only by the steady beeping of Yuki's heart monitor and the faint, uneven breaths of the kittens huddled together under the glow of the heating pad. Hina, still crouched beside the frail mother cat, kept her gaze locked on Takumi, waiting for him to speak, but it was clear he wasn't sure how to begin. "She belonged to a woman named Asami," he finally said, his voice quieter than before, as if the name itself carried a ghost of something long buried. "She used to live in this town a few years ago, had this small, rented apartment above the old tailor shop near the station, kept to herself mostly. But that cat, she was always with her. A white beauty just like this one." He gestured toward Yuki, his expression unreadable. "Then one day she was gone. No warning, no forwarding address, nothing. People assumed she moved out of the city, maybe went back to her family. But the cat, she was left behind." A slow chill crept down my spine. Abandoned. Left to fend for herself in a city that had long since stopped caring for its forgotten things. My gaze flickered to Yuki, her frail body still, her breath shallow but determined. She had survived on the streets for years, hunted, scavenged, endured the cruel indifference of time, all while carrying life inside her. Hina leaned back on her heels, exhaling softly. "If she had an owner, we should try to find her. See if she wants her back." Takumi shook his head before she even finished speaking. "She's not coming back," he said simply. "And even if she was, you think someone who left her to die would suddenly want her again?" His voice held no anger, just a quiet certainty, a painful acceptance of human nature at its worst. I stared at Yuki, my throat tightening. The weight of responsibility pressed against me, heavier than before. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. This was a reckoning. A choice that, whether I wanted it or not, was now mine to make. The room felt different now, heavier, as if the truth Takumi had just laid before us had thickened the very air we breathed. Yuki's past wasn't just an abstract tragedy. It was real, deliberate, a story of abandonment written in the bones beneath her thinning fur. My mind kept circling the same thought. She wasn't a stray by chance. She had been left. Forgotten. The idea gnawed at me, something raw and unsettled twisting deep in my chest. The kittens stirred, their tiny bodies pressing against each other, as if the instinct to survive was the only thing keeping them moving. They had no understanding of the weight hanging over them, no comprehension of the decisions being made around them. All they knew was warmth, the quiet hum of existence, the soft murmurs of voices above them. Hina's voice cut through my thoughts, steady but edged with something almost defensive. "We can't assume she was abandoned on purpose." She glanced at Takumi, her brow creased. "People go through things. Maybe she had no choice." Takumi scoffed, shaking his head. "There's always a choice." He exhaled through his nose, folding his arms. "She didn't leave a note, didn't ask anyone to take care of the cat. She just disappeared. That wasn't a mistake." I swallowed hard, the room shrinking around me. It didn't matter if it had been a mistake or not. What mattered was what came next. Hina must have seen the conflict in my face because she softened slightly, her voice quieter now. "Renji, this is a lot. I get it, but you need to ask yourself, what do you want to do?" What did I want? I had never been the kind of person who saw an abandoned animal on the street and thought, I should take them home. I had never planned for this, never expected to be here, caught between responsibility and uncertainty. But when I looked at Yuki, barely clinging to life, and her 3 kittens, helpless and unaware of just how fragile their existence was, the thought of leaving them behind, of letting fate take its course, made me sick to my stomach. Still, the fear crept in, the questions I wasn't ready to answer. What if Yuki didn't survive? What if the kittens didn't? What if I wasn't enough? The clock on the wall ticked, marking the passing of another moment, another breath, another chance to walk away. But I knew, even before the words left my mouth, I already knew. I'm not leaving them. My voice felt stronger than I expected. Whatever happens, I'll figure it out. Takumi studied me, unreadable, before nodding slowly. Hina exhaled, as if she had been holding her breath. Yuki lay still, unaware that a decision had just been made in her favor, that her life, whatever remained of it, was no longer entirely her own. But the decision was only the beginning. Now came the part where I had to live with it. The decision sat heavy in my chest, final and irreversible, yet the reality of what it meant had barely begun to sink in. I had spoken the words, I wasn't leaving them, but the consequences of that promise were still forming, stretching into unknown corners of my life where I had never imagined responsibility waiting. The weight of it pressed against me, not just in the physical sense of caring for 4 fragile lives, but in the quiet, daunting understanding that I had stepped into something bigger than myself. Hina nodded, already moving, her hands working with quiet efficiency to stabilize Yuki, to ensure the fragile mother had even the smallest chance of seeing another sunrise. Takumi, though his expression remained unreadable, lingered near the door, his fingers tapping absently against his sleeve. There was something in his posture, hesitation, maybe even doubt, that made me wonder if he had expected me to walk away. "You realize this isn't just about money, right?" he said finally, his voice low, edged with something that wasn't quite skepticism, but wasn't encouragement either. "It's not just vet bills and food. You're committing to them, for as long as they need you." I knew what he was really asking. "Are you sure? Was I sure?" "No, of course not. But did it matter?" "I know," I said, though the full weight of those words still hadn't settled into my bones. "I'm not backing out." Takumi exhaled sharply, a sound that was half amusement, half disbelief. He muttered, shaking his head as if he had seen too many people in my position before, people who thought they could save the world, people who had no idea what they were walking into. Hina, still tending to Yuki, barely glanced up as she spoke. "She's stable for now, but it's too soon to tell. The next few days will decide everything. We'll have to bottle feed the kittens until she's strong enough. And if she doesn't make it..." She trailed off, but I understood. The responsibility wouldn't end with her. The kittens would still need me. I looked down at them, at their impossibly small bodies curled against each other, and the fear crept in again. Not just for them, but for myself. What if I wasn't enough? What if I failed them? But the thing about choices is that once they're made, you have to follow through. There was no turning back now. "I'll do whatever it takes," I said, the words steady, even though the ground beneath them still felt uncertain. And just like that, my life was no longer just my own. The night stretched long and quiet, the kind of silence that carried the weight of waiting, of uncertainty thick enough to settle into the walls. Yuki lay motionless, except for the shallow rise and fall of her ribs, her body so light, so impossibly fragile, that it seemed as though she might disappear if I looked away for too long. The kittens, warmed by the heating pad, stirred occasionally, their tiny paws twitching in restless, instinctual movements, their bellies still sunken from hunger. They needed her. But whether she would be there for them tomorrow was still a question that hung heavy in the air. I sat on the worn-out chair beside the exam table, my fingers laced together, staring at nothing in particular. I had told myself I would stay, that I had made my choice. But as the hours passed, as exhaustion pulled at my limbs, and the weight of responsibility settled deeper into my bones, the fear took root. I had stepped into this without hesitation, moved by instinct, by the raw pull of something unexplainable. But what if I had been wrong? Takumi had left hours ago, his expression unreadable, his parting words clipped but laced with something that almost sounded like respect. Hina was still here, moving between the kittens and Yuki, tending to them in quiet efficiency, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. She hadn't spoken much since I made my decision, but now, as she adjusted the fluids dripping into Yuki's IV, she glanced at me, her voice softer than before. "You can still walk away," she said, not unkindly. "No one would blame you." The words sat between us, an unspoken understanding woven into them. I could leave. I could tell myself I had done my part, that I had carried them this far, and that was enough. I could close the door behind me and step back into the life I had before this, simple, uncomplicated, untouched by the responsibility of 4 fragile lives. But when I looked at Yuki, at the way her ears flicked ever so slightly, as if she was still fighting to hold on, and at the kittens pressed into each other, their tiny bodies dependent on the warmth of something bigger than themselves, I knew. I had already made my choice. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice steady, even as exhaustion crept into my bones. Hina studied me for a moment, then nodded, as if she had been waiting to hear that. "Good," she murmured, turning back to Yuki, "because this isn't over yet." And as I sat there listening to the quiet hum of machines, the soft breaths of the kittens, the uncertain rhythm of Yuki's life, still clinging to the edge of survival, I realized she was right. This was just the beginning. The first rays of dawn seeped through the clinic window, casting long golden streaks across the floor, the kind of light that softened edges, that made even the stark scent of antiseptic feel a little less sterile. I hadn't slept. My body ached from staying in the same hunched position all night, my limbs stiff, my head heavy with exhaustion, but I refused to move. The night had been too fragile, too delicate, every second stretched into an eternity as I watched, waited, listened. Every shallow breath Yuki took feeling like it might be her last. Hina had checked on her periodically, expression unreadable, her movements mechanical, but I could see the tension in her jaw, the way she barely looked at me, as if she didn't want to be the one to say what we both knew. If Yuki didn't make it through the night, there was nothing else we could do, but as the morning light painted across the room, something shifted. Yuki stirred. Just the slightest movement, her front paw twitching, her whiskers barely flicking, but it was something. My breath caught, my body stiffening as I leaned forward. Her ears flicked again, and then slowly her eyes opened. It was faint, unfocused, but there was life in them. Weak, fragile life, but life, nonetheless. Hina inhaled sharply beside me, already moving, already assessing. "She's responding," she murmured, the quiet weight in her voice breaking into something like astonishment. "She's actually responding." My chest tightened as I stared down at her, at the cat who had been at death's door just hours ago, now fighting her way back. The relief hit me harder than I expected, a knot in my throat forming as my shoulders sagged. I hadn't realized how much I had braced myself for the worst. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Hina placed a hand on my shoulder, her voice softer now. "She's not in the clear, Renji. This is just the first step. She'll need care, attention, more than just a vet visit." She hesitated, then added, "This is going to be a long road. Are you sure you're ready for that?" I looked at Yuki, at the kittens curled up beside her, tiny and unaware of the battle their mother had just fought. I thought about the alley, the damp, the cold, the way they had clung to her even when she had nothing left to give. I had never been sure. Not from the beginning. But as I reached out, letting my fingers graze against Yuki's fur, feeling the faint warmth of life pulsing beneath her skin, I knew there was no going back. "I don't know if I'm ready," I admitted, my voice quieter now, more raw, "but I'm not leaving her." Hina studied me for a moment, then nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Then let's get to work." And just like that, the story I thought had ended in an alleyway that night, the moment I found 3 helpless kittens pressed against their dying mother, was only just beginning. Days passed in a blur of careful monitoring, sleepless nights, and moments of quiet victories, so small they almost felt insignificant, until I realized they weren't. Yuki was weak, but she was eating, lifting her head more each day, her eyes gaining focus, her movements no longer just instinctive twitches, but deliberate, measured efforts. The kittens, still impossibly small, were beginning to respond as well, their bodies filling out, their cries becoming stronger, more insistent, no longer the desperate whimpers of creatures on the brink of fading away. It wasn't easy. I had never known exhaustion like this, never known what it was like to build an entire day around tiny lives dependent on me for everything. But there were moments, quiet, unexpected moments, where I would catch Yuki watching me, her tired golden eyes no longer vacant, no longer lost in the haze of sickness and survival. There was something else there now, something I couldn't name. I had walked into that alley expecting nothing more than a quiet morning with my camera. Instead, I had found something I never knew I needed, a purpose I hadn't been searching for, but one that had found me anyway. Not every story ends with certainty. I don't know what the future holds, for them or for me, but I do know this. That night, when I heard those cries in the alley, I could have walked away, and I didn't. And sometimes that's where everything begins. If this story moved you, remember, rescue isn't just about saving lives. It's about making a choice to stop when others keep walking, a choice to care, even when it's inconvenient, a choice to stay, even when it would be easier to leave. Not every rescue story has a perfect ending, but every act of kindness leaves a mark. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who believes in second chances. And if you ever hear a cry for help, whether it's a stray in an alley or someone who simply needs to be heard, know that what you do next could change everything. Because sometimes a single moment of compassion is all it takes to rewrite a life.